Hi everybody, I've got James Hughes here today. He's the Executive Director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's a bioethicist, a sociologist at Trinity College, where he teaches health policy and serves as Director of Institutional Research and Planning. He holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago, where he also taught at the McLaren Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. The author of Citizen Cyborg and a new and up-and-coming book called Cyborg Buddha. We've been watching the news. There's been quite a bit of Turing test in it. James, would you like to give me a quick review of your impressions, critiques of this new chatbot, Eugene Goostman, and his deserved or undeserved fame?
Well, I don't pay much attention to the Turing test. I've never considered it very ethically or cognitively significant. It's, and when I teach research methods to students, we have the concept of test validity, and there are many ways of ensuring test validity especially for things that can't be measured directly. So consciousness is one of these things that can't be measured directly. Because it's an intrasubjective experience, and we're never sure that other people are conscious, and we're not going to be sure that robots are conscious. The best that we can do is correlate a bunch of facts about things that we know about our own and other people's consciousness, or that we assume about them, and then see, when we apply it to robots or machines, see how many of those things we can bring into congruence. So with the case of contemporary machine intelligence, we know that they don't have the cognitive sophistication for true, intersubjective experience and or even machine learning and the kinds of things that it would take to be a fully effective human surrogate in the way that, for instance, in the movie Her, the robot, develops and learns over time and has a real relationship with the human being. Whether she actually has intersubjective experience or not, we assume she does. But that kind of full, sophisticated human interaction, we know that machines aren't capable of that yet. So whatever accomplishment a machine like Eugene Goostman might be able to do in a limited test is not really going to be very convincing for anything at this point.
So I guess what you're saying is the Turing test isn't really a good indicator of general AI, and that people should know this. I think there's a lot of people who may have initially been a bit sort of wow factored about it, given the sort of the very positive news that was coming out about, hey, it's finally been done, What does this mean? So what does it mean if the Turing test has been passed?
Well, it doesn't mean a lot because some human beings don't pass the Turing test. If you were to put the average 13-year-old, Twitter or text feed into this process, you wouldn't be absolutely sure that you were communicating with a human being. So I don't think it's a good test of human consciousness. I don't think it's a good test of machine consciousness. I think there are some sociological implications that as we approach the ability of machines to simulate first text-based and then verbal and then full audiovisual communication with human beings in a way that's convincing simulacrum of human communication, we will have increasingly effective and satisfying replacements for human service employees. And that's one of the things I'm concerned about, that we're entering into a period of technological unemployment, and that one of the ways that we're going to get there is that a lot of human service employment is already being replaced by things like extended computer-based verbal interactions with machines that parse you into which particular part of their frequently asked questions document you need to be attuned to, or which office in a large corporate structure you actually need to be connected to. Those have already replaced a lot of people who used to do that kind of work. And as we get to the point where an Amazon chatbot convinces you that it has as much going on as a human being does, if you're not able to distinguish that chatbot from an actual human being, then I think we're actually at a place where a lot more human beings are going to be replaced, because a lot of people opt out of those computer-based interactions and say, I want to talk to a human being. And so the more that we get rid of those human beings, it's going to have a lot of implications.
Right. So it seems as though it would be good to know where we're at, to track the progress in AIs that are able to do the things that you suggest. But it's pretty hard to do so. It's a very fuzzy thing. Like this concept of intelligence, people disagree about. But yeah, if we okay. So if human psychology finds it difficult to deal with fuzzy estimates and probabilities, pitfalls aside, what is the use of communicating less reliable observational models of progress in AI?
Well, that's not really my bailiwick. So I know you've talked to Ben Goertzel. I'd shoot that question back over to Ben. I mean, I think that my principal concerns are the ethical and the philosophical, which is that this isn't an indication of intersubjective experience, and that is ultimately going to be a much more complicated process of attempting to correlate our knowledge of the architecture of the machine itself with its behavior. There may be that we have architectures and machines that we think have intersubjective experience, and its behavior doesn't correspond to human behavior at all. I mean, we're not able to have a conversation with it because it's running at a million times our clock speed, or it's trying to communicate with the patterns of the ocean and the stock market or something like that, Yeah. And vice versa, we can have these very convincing chatbots and know that their architecture don't support intersubjective experience. So in terms of that philosophical cognitive question, that's something I'm interested in, and I don't think we're anywhere close yet. And it's going to take a much more complicated process to begin to, as you say, probabilistically convince ourselves that we are getting closer and closer to that goal. And then the other set of concerns I have is the sociological, just what effect these various kinds of progress in artificial intelligence have on human labor and the way that we interact with machines and the consequences for human society. We recently took on, as an affiliate scholar at the IET, Kate Darling, who does research at MIT, and she's been doing experiments with trying to get people to torture plushy robots, that little robots that talk, little dinosaurs and things. And she finds that it's very difficult once people have just a brief bonding experience with these robots, which we know have absolutely nothing going on inside of them except a pull string that makes them say certain things. If you hold them upside down by their tail, they squeal, and that gives enough of a simulacrum of consciousness in these machines that then when she asks people to smash the machine, they don't want to do it. And so then what's the implication for human beings as we get increasingly close to that simulation of consciousness and pain? What's the implications for human society? Just as with animals, we're not absolutely sure that fish feel pain in the sense that, that is ethically meaningful, in the sense that, there's a conscious being in there that is registering, I'm a suffering creature. There's a difference between having pain neurons send sensation to a brain and having a suffering creature. But nonetheless, we can assume that it's probably not a good indication for a kid's psychosocial development if they get a lot of pleasure out of torturing fish or ants or things that don't feel pain. Even if it's not feeling pain and therefore is not a moral subject in its own sense, it may be a bad indication for us if we start torturing those kinds of creatures. So there may be implications for for humanity as we get closer to these kinds of goals, even if the creatures themselves aren't moral subjects.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting what people think about these machines before they actually become entities with subjective experiences. And as we approach, I guess, more cognitive sophistication in these machines, will things like Eugene Goostman make people think twice about the future of artificial intelligence? Or will this relative unsophistication that's behind the chatbot reinforce some existing beliefs that, computers will never achieve these interesting things? They won't never reach the gold standard of human intellect, yeah?
I suspect that most of us are subject to confirmation bias on these kinds of questions. So if people are firm human exceptionalists, then they're always going to move the goalpost and say whatever AI has accomplished is not yet, significant morally or ethically. And if they are believers in a coming, technopocalypse, then they're going to see every inch in this direction as a confirmation of their apocalyptic anxieties. So I'm not sure that we're moving the dial very much. I do think that there will be a tipping point. I suspect that the tipping point will have more to do with the impacts of automation and robotics on the economy than it will on, our ability to communicate with them as an indicator. So, once a lot of people lose their jobs to robots, you can expect that kind of Luddite backlash that we saw 180 years ago in England. And forestalling that, because I don't think that would be good for society to have that kind of reaction to robotics. I think that's one of the challenges that we foresighted futurists need to be working towards, is to make sure that there are more positive responses to the challenges of robotics than the Luddite reaction.
Right. So the Luddite reaction obviously probably wouldn't achieve much. It may even ratchet up the owners of the robots, of the artificial intelligences, paranoia of of the poor class or whatnot. So yeah, I'm worried about that. Are we standing on the bridge of how far away do you think that this is likely to happen, where people start seriously losing a lot of jobs, and the economy is mostly driven by robots? Or are we there now?
Well, since the year 2000 in the United States, the proportion of the population that's in paid employment has fallen steadily, and we have been seeing some economic recovery in the last couple of years in the United States, but we're not adding a sufficient number of jobs to keep up with population growth. Part of the changes that are happening in the U.S. and Europe and Australia, most of the industrialized world, are that the population is rapidly aging. So part of the decline in the proportion of the population employed is that people are retiring out. This is also of concern to us futurists because we think that we're probably on the cusp of some dramatic breakthroughs in anti-aging therapy that will continue the secular trend towards greater longevity. And so on both of those counts, the fact that we're going to be confronting an old age dependency ratio skewing in the direction of a lot of retirees, as well as the fact that automation appears to already be slowing or reversing the possibility of economic recovery from periods of unemployment. I think we're already, confronting that issue. But in the coming 2 decades, I'm basically an accelerationist in this respect, that I do believe that we're seeing acceleration, certainly in computing and cybernetic technologies, and in a lot of fields, as Ray Kurzweil has doggedly attempted to prove. And insofar as those accelerationist trends far outpace the ability of human beings to retrain for new occupations or even to find occupations that they might be competitive in, I think we're going to see this trend towards technological unemployment accelerate in the coming couple of decades.
Well, okay, so it may not be that people will be sort of scared away from technology by anthropomorphic robots approaching an uncanny valley effect, but is there an uncanny valley for behavior, not necessarily appearance? Like if some people trust machine intelligence that is not too close to the human form of intelligence, perhaps even considered like an alien form of intelligence, will this affect people's judgments around the safety of machines compared to what they would, how they would trust the machines if they were more human-like?
Yeah, well, I do believe in the uncanny valley. I think it fits with a long trend of research in structural functionalist theory, for instance, Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas. The idea is that we have deep set of categories in the way that we think about society and the world in every culture, and that in every culture when people or things fall between those categories, they become liminal and dangerous, sometimes sacred, as a consequence. So I do think that the uncanny valley fits into a long line of that kind of research. But in terms of designing robots in particular that interact with human beings, that's a relatively easy thing to fix. I mean, we could either, if people get squicked out by talking to a robot on the phone that they're not sure if it's a robot or not, then there's probably ways to just indicate this is a robot or this isn't. And similarly with I don't think we're going to get that close very quickly with robotic interfaces, actual physical robots very, very soon. I mean, I think it's going to be pretty clear that we're talking to robots for quite a while. But if we do get to that point, we could put a big red dot on the middle of their head or something to indicate when we're talking to robots and when we aren't. Mm-hmm. So in terms of their social policy or their social integration, I don't see that as the biggest issue, although it is psychologically important.
Right. Okay. So do you think people will trust? Well, what about the type of intelligence a machine may have instead of the look and feel? What about like if a human-like robot or somebody, a robot that's sort of similar to the robot in Her or the AI in the movie Her that was so sociable and so sort of quirky just right and, politically correct in certain times and was so aware of people's emotion, would people be freaked out by that?
Well, definitely. I think that one of the things that Her suggests is that having a personal assistant who had access to all of our life files and was artificially intelligent would provide a level of insight into our own behavior and cognition and, habits that we would probably find quite startling, and quite challenging sometimes. Having a robot that could say, "Hey, dude, you're really drinking too much and overcome, or you're eating too much, or you're masturbating too much, you're watching too much porn," whatever those kinds of interventions. People, of course, I assume that most of us would want to have options to say, "Don't tell me these things." If you find these things, don't bother telling me about them. But on the other hand, one of my concerns with moral enhancement is that most of us want machines that enhance our self-control, enhance our capacities for compassion, enhance our capacities for happiness. And there is a substantial body of literature on what kinds of behaviors and life habits lead to happiness, self-control, and so forth. And therefore, I would want a robot, a personal assistant that had that level of intimate understanding of my life, as long as it was not being shared with Google. I think this is another part of the problem, is that the reason we don't even share some of these kinds of details with our closest life partners is because it's so embarrassing. We might not have that level of embarrassment with an AI, as a non-judgmental AI that was programmed just to serve our needs. And so we might then be fully have full disclosure with them about these kinds of things in our lives, and that they might then be able to provide that kind of help to us that we couldn't even get from other human beings. So I'm actually, personally, I think that most people would welcome this, and that this would be a great innovation, as long as these concerns about privacy could be ameliorated. And this gets to another point, which is that in terms of the marketability of AI, most of us don't want AI with self-awareness, because you don't want to have an AI that starts judging you. You want the AI to say, based on the research that has been done, these behaviors that you're doing are probably a bad idea and will lead to these consequences. You don't want it to say, geez, you're a bad person. You don't want it to have a moral judgment. You don't want it to reject you because it decides that it doesn't like your behavior or your personality anymore. So, you don't want your refrigerator to tell you, I'm not going to open because I think you're eating too many carbs. You want it to say, this is how many carbs you've eaten today. We don't want computers in general with volition of their own. We don't want them with consciousness of their own. That adds nothing to the human project. What we want is extensions of human intelligence into tools that will then provide us with a better ability to achieve our needs and wants. So I think this is one of the fundamental problems with the way that we think about AI, and Jaron Lanier has pointed this out. I'm not sure he's absolutely right, but he thinks that there's a deep goal that you can see, for instance, in the paperclip icon that Microsoft used to have for the Office suite. The paperclip would pop up and say, "It looks like you're trying to do X. Let me help you with that." And he saw in those kinds of interventions deep belief in Silicon Valley that we all wanted self-aware robots to help us with our lives. I don't think we actually do. We want an exocortex. We want our own amygdala and cortical functions to be expanded into the capacities of computing, but not to have a twin sitting on our shoulder who starts commenting on our lives. So that's a fundamentally different conception of what the goal is.
Right, yeah. It brings up an interesting philosophical quandary. I mean, if we could develop, I guess, something like a philosophical, non-judgmental zombie, what kinds of experiences could we have with this AI agent, this digital symbiont or twin or whatever, that we couldn't have if it were conscious? What could we have with a conscious? What could we achieve with a conscious AI that we couldn't achieve with an unconscious AI?
Well, I think Her suggests that for many people, the evidence of an intersubjective experience is necessary for having what we consider a truly authentic relationship, a non-predictable relationship. The capacity of the other to like or dislike, reject, accept us is necessary for what we currently consider an authentic experience. This goes back to one of the first philosophical texts that ever rocked my boat, which was What Sort of People Should There Be by Jonathan Glover. And he talks in there about the virtual experience machine and kind of unpacks why we are uncomfortable with the notion of an experience machine. He says, well, one reason we would be uncomfortable living in a virtual reality is if everybody else was, just a simulacrum and we weren't actually having conversations with real human beings, or real consciousnesses that could be unpredictable and do things that might cause us suffering. And that most people's idea of a eudaimonic or a truly flourishing life means having a little bit of that unpredictability that comes from having relationships with other intersubjective beings. So insofar as we want robot lovers or true robot life companions, then yes, we want them to have those intersubjective experiences. Insofar as we want something that extend, a true personal assistant that will never get tired and never go on strike and never divorce us and so forth, and never have any problems with, those personal assistants will not ideally have intersubjective experience. Well, I mean, there's plenty of examples in literature of the P.G. Wodehouse novels where the butler is is more intelligent than the top that it's serving, and then you have some kind of advantage of having a super self-aware, conscious, humorous, personal assistant. But I don't think, in general, people wanted the codes of conduct of butlers was pretty severe in general. They weren't supposed to comment on your personal behavior. They certainly weren't supposed to divorce you because they didn't like you. So, I still think that's the direction that things will go.
Okay. Yes, well, that was very close to one of my questions I intended to ask. But I wanted to talk about focused Turing tests and taking the idea of the Turing test, that is just testing for some form of machine capability instead of just basic intelligence for a text interface. So, look, I imagine there will be lines of people ready to sit on a judge's panel for a Turing test for machine intimacy, for instance. But I mean, that you're alluding to the fact that we may not want sentience in a machine or consciousness in a machine. Would we trust our machines, or to have that if we were intimate with them, or would we just want them as sort of non-conscious automatons that do what we need and do what we want all the time?
Well, I certainly think we need to have a full-fledged model of how we test for and assess the capacities, the emotional capacities of machines. I mean, the first set of tests will be about affective accuracy, basically. And we're already doing this research. We're already trying to figure out if robots can read our faces to determine what emotions we're displaying. And then more interestingly, I think that there will be things like Wi-Fi. So recently it was determined that using Wi-Fi signals in a room, you can determine the respiration and heart rate of people in the room. So it could be that, robots, just with the existing information that they would have access to in the machine environment, would have more information about our own emotional state than we would have usually ourselves. So that kind of effective knowledge, affective in terms of affect, in terms of emotion, that kind of knowledge, I think, will be incredibly important for having human service workers, for instance, that understand the things that they need to, that understand, in quotes, the things that they need to do to accomplish the work that they've been assigned. And we want to have tests for that. But again, consciousness isn't really that necessary. I mean, those are a set of algorithms that we can teach one another and we can teach machines. Having a robot that can do medical diagnostics does not require intersubjective consciousness. It just requires a complex set of algorithms. I don't really believe that medical intuition adds anything. The evidence is not there that medical intuition adds any accuracy to the process. It just distracts from it. So the more accurate we make machines does not necessarily imply anything about their intersubjective experience. It does make them more and more similar to the simulacrum of human beings. So then in terms of whether we've gotten to intersubjective experience in certain kinds of machines, because that is an ethically important question, a politically important question, and perhaps an existentially important question, because I think part of intersubjective experience is having your own desires and wishes. And to the degree that we ever create computers that have their own desires and wishes, that's going to be very dangerous for us. And so we want to make sure that we're doing all these other things, creating emotional sensitivity, emotional intelligence, general intelligence, and so forth, without this intersubjective experience, sense of identity, and personal desires. The zombies, as you said. We want to make sure that we're creating zombies instead of Terminators. And so part of that testing process and architecture, figuring out what's actually going on inside of them, will be very important.
Interesting. Yeah, I have a sense that would be a good first move in developing AI. But let's just say, like you mentioned before, that even with a few, like a toy with a few cues to tell a human that it has some form of like emotion, but it doesn't. It just pretends. It's not the toy that's pretending. It's been developed to give people the impression that it's in pain if you turn it upside down, that it makes whining noises if you're mistreating it. So people imprint on have these toys imprint on themselves, and so if we end up in a world where people have all these robotic lovers and intimate sort of machines, if they really learn to love these machines, won't they secretly want them to have a subjective experience, even though they know, like they feel as though they're in love with this machine, they feel as though the love the machine gives them is real? Will they be tempted to cross the line and offer up to these wonderful machines to do all our bidding and treat us so nicely and seem incredibly emotionally mature and intelligent and like angels in a sense? Wouldn't we want to bestow them with this unique gift that humans have? Well, not unique to humans, animals as well, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people would. I mean, you can see the tendency towards that already when you have conversations with people about animal uplift. Most people aren't terribly impressed with my arguments for the ethical obligation to uplift chimpanzees or dolphins. But if you talk about their cats and dogs, a lot of people will say, oh, well, my cat and dog, sure, why not? That'd be great if they were a little bit more intelligent. If they, if I could convince them not to poop in the corner or, claw the couch a little bit more easily and have a more intelligent conversation with them and try to figure out why my cat's so distant and indifferent. Those kinds of relationships. But those, having relationships with mammals, uplifted mammals, more intelligent mammals, is going to be a completely different prospect than having a relationship with machine mind, which will have a completely different architecture than the one that we have evolved with. Even if it's been designed to have the same architecture as a mammal, the same mental architecture, to have proprioceptive awareness of a physical body simulated inside its software, whatever other things we might give it. Even if we do all that, it's still going to be completely different than what a mammal has. So, dogs and human beings have co-evolved for 20,000 years, and they look at our left eye to figure out what our emotional clues are, and they're totally attuned to human emotional cues in ways that we don't even aren't even aware of. So, I think having an uplifted dog would be a far better prospect for having an intelligent, devoted companion than having an intelligent AI. But you remind me of this, there's a lot of adages here. It gets pretty deep in terms of what is the nature of love. If you love something, let it go. So you could imagine, having a kind of zombie control on our super intelligent AI, and you could become so attached to it, and you say, oh, I love you so much, I'm going to let your mind go, and you can uplift yourself now into the God realm or whatever. And I'm sure that will be a temptation for people, and we may have to have a lot of laws to say no uplifting of your AI lovers, because that creates an existential threat.
Yeah, well, yes, I guess that's a very good argument for regulation, but it would surely it would make people annoyed. People would want to see the best for their lover robots. I don't know how it would play out. But even if an AI didn't have actual consciousness, it could still, if one of these human lovers, it could still learn an argument for giving itself an uplift, right? And it could perhaps do so in a much more effective way. And it wouldn't have to want to be uplifted. All it would have to do is just be the loving robot of its companion, human companion, and just try and fulfill the wills of the human companion. If it's the will of the human companion that the robot uplifts, and maybe with the intention that it takes the human with it, then the robot could have a very convincing argument.
Well, it gets deep here. If you go back to Star Trek Next Generation, you had Data the robot.
Yeah.
He supposedly never got his emotion chip. There was a whole sequence where he gets an emotion chip and all hell breaks loose. But he, for most of the series, doesn't have an emotion chip. Yet he has the Pinocchio complex. He wants to be a real boy. Where does this real boy desire come from if he doesn't have any emotions, right? If he's the perfect emotionless robot, then he would be the perfect servant of the Federation, of his Starfleet, prerogatives. He wouldn't have these conflicting, I wish I had emotions, I wish I had dude, that's an emotion. You have an emotion, it's called the desire for emotion. So, he may not have sophisticated emotions, but he has an emotion. That's the problem right there, wanting something, a robot that wants something. So, yes, it may be that in order to have a truly satisfying human service worker, or a truly satisfying AI prostitute, or a truly satisfying AI butler, it has to give us the simulacrum that it wants something and that it has emotions. That if we wanted the perfect P.G. Wodehouse butler, it would have to display some kind of wry amusement at our behavior and laugh at our jokes and things like that. It would have to have all the simulacrum of self-awareness and that level of consciousness, but without actually having it, hopefully. And so, that's going to be a really complicated terrain to navigate.
Especially complicated because we haven't really found out what the neural correlates are for consciousness. And yes, many people argue that they don't have, we don't have a really solid theory of consciousness. So designing away from it may be a particularly difficult thing to do, or at least designing away from the conditions in which it may emerge.
Right.
Yeah. You're going to comment on that? It's okay.
Well, it's not. Thankfully, I'm not one of the designers. I just am, in the peanut gallery, throwing peanuts and commenting on what people do.
Yes.
But I guess my main comment is that I think a lot of the people in our futurist neck of the woods have an overly simplified, overly linear, and overly unitary model of human consciousness, that they assume that self-awareness and desire, all these things are going to come along naturally as a part of the development of all these other faculties. And I do believe that consciousness is emergent and, a product of complexity. I think it's possible that these features could emerge naturally in something like the internet. It could emerge in other complex interstices of human machine, interactions, whatever. I think that in some sense organizations have always been meta-human artificial intelligence, that the Catholic Church is a form of artificial intelligence that's self-aware and reproducing.
But it doesn't make condoms.
Well, it doesn't work. All the better to do its impregnation around the world. Mm-hmm. I think that most of the people in the AI field are thinking about, if I can get the box to be increasingly smart, it'll eventually do everything the human brain does. And that's an incredibly limited perspective on what the mind space possibility actually is out there.
Well, you talked about a box. It's often very hard to see what's inside a black box, and sometimes it seems as though we may get to very smart intelligence by evolving it through deep neural nets and reinforcement learning hybrids, such as the DeepMind algorithm, or AI that was sold to Google. So look, assuming that we can't see everything inside an AI's head, What would a Turing test for machine morality look like, and would it differ from a sort of so-called human morality test, or a Turing test for human morality, for psychopathy or sociopathy or narcissism?
Well, we have tests for psychopathy and narcissism. We have psychological inventories that, insofar as people answer questions honestly, which is a part of the problem with the psychopathic mind, then we can determine with human beings how psychopathic, or what we call the dark triad, psychopathy, narcissism, and other negative personality traits. So we have those tests. How applicable they're going to be to a machine, who knows? I mean, I think behavioral tests are probably going to be more applicable. And part of the complexity there is that, children are in general pretty psychopathic. They have some moral sensibilities, some empathetic sensibilities, but there is a developmental progression of moral self-control and moral reasoning that we will presumably also see in increasingly sophisticated AI. So that at first, one of the first kind of moral conclusions the children arrive at is the good is what's in their own self-interest. And then it takes a little bit more effort for them to get to the point where the good is what powerful people tell you the good is. And then they, work up to social contract theory if they're lucky, and then they work up eventually to, social democratic. And what I'm recapitulating here is Kohlberg's theory of developmental moral reasoning, which I think is fairly well supported. The complexity is that he was working with human beings, and most human beings never even got up to the levels of what he considered the highest levels of moral complexity. The logic that Kohlberg used, by the way, to ground his theory was similar to the Piagetian. It was based on Piagetian theory, which is that there is a logical progression of certain kinds of concepts. You have to know about object permanence before you can make projections about other things. To know that if you throw the ball around the corner, it's still going to be there. That requires object permanence. So, in a sense, applying that to morality, it requires proving that people at a certain level of moral reasoning had gone through previous stages of moral reasoning and could explain those previous stages of moral reasoning. Well, some people see it this way, but I don't see it that way anymore. I see it like this. But that the people at those previous stages of moral reasoning can't explain the higher stages of moral reasoning. That proves that there's a developmental process. So at any rate, he thought that about 10% of people in the industrialized world had arrived at the broad liberal democratic highest stage of moral reasoning, which was there's a general social contract, we should all treat each other nicely, except some of the laws may be unjust, and that I have a right of civil disobedience and personal conscience that transcends even the social contract. So it may be that is in fact the highest level of moral reasoning that we see, commonly in the population today. But the problem is if we become smarter, and certainly if our machines start to work on moral reasoning, there may be levels of moral reasoning beyond that. Natural law, we don't believe in natural law because we're not able to discern any moral codes in the universe. But what if at a certain level of intelligence you suddenly do click into, oh my God, there is in fact a natural law in the universe.
A categorical imperative.
A categorical imperative or God's plan or whatever it is. And that transcends everything else. And on the basis of that universal moral law, I have to kill all human beings. So, we just don't know what it's going to look like. But I do think that it's possible both to test for moral immorality and immoral personality traits, and test for moral reasoning. Certainly to test for things like self-control, probably empathic capacity, and so forth. And again, this will rely on a complex back and forth between our knowledge of the architecture of the machine and our testing of its experience, because the two won't always say the same thing.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, like, I was imagining before in some of the examples that you were giving, like, for instance, a test for psychopathy. If people lie on the test, then it's difficult to really tell if they're a psychopath or they're just trying to, I don't know, look like a martyr or something, or look important. So, I mean, we could also use sort of BCI's pulse controls, eye scanners, and all those sorts of things to detect likelihoods of whether they're lying or not. But would we be able to tell if a machine was lying? How would we know?
Right. They're not going to have a galvanic skin response to put them in a lie detector. They're not going to have a brain scan that shows that they're spending more time on lies than on truth. So, yeah, I mean, one of the ways that we test for it in the social sciences is we ask them the same question a couple different times, a couple different ways, and see if their story changes. We ask them questions where we know that they're, do you ever pick your nose? No, I never pick my nose. Okay, they're a liar. So, there are ways to get at it in the social sciences. We'll have to figure out what ways there might be in the cognitive AI realm.
Well, okay, so first of all, what would you do if you were tested and you found out that you were a psychopath?
Well, this, of course, is happening. There is this book out, Ron Johnson's book, The Psychopath Test, and then there's a researcher, I'm spacing on the guy's name, but a famous neurogeneticist who accidentally had his own gene results and brain scans show up in his data and diagnosed himself with psychopathy before he realized that it was his results that he's looking at. And so I think one of the things that the psychopathy research demonstrates is that you can be a high-functioning, socially integrated psychopath. In other words, you can have a deficit in the traits of empathy and so forth that would lead some people towards psychopathic behavior, what we consider psychopathic behavior, but have had a sufficiently nurturant, morally guided upbringing that it doesn't lead you to any psychopathic behavior. And that was certainly true with this neuroscientist I'm thinking of. He, had never hurt anyone intentionally, but when he was fully honest and introspective and thought about something like, what if my family were to be killed in a freak accident? Would I really give a crap? No. That's a hard thing for someone to acknowledge about themselves. One of the most famous research ethics cases is the Milgram experiments, where we put people into a situation where they thought that they were teaching somebody else how to learn through shocking them. And a significant proportion of the people in those experiments would shock people under the goading of the white lab coat scientist, would shock people into silence where they might, in fact, have killed them. Then they were debriefed and said, well, you didn't actually kill anybody, but it just turns out that you're the kind of person who, if they had been sent as a guard to Auschwitz, wouldn't have had a problem killing people. Okay, well, thanks for that little bit of introspection and a little bit of insight into my character. And the reason it's so troubling morally is what kind of informed consent. We couldn't have done the experiment with giving true informed consent, saying we're going to put you in a situation where we're going to test if you're a psychopath, because that wouldn't work. And therefore, we did psychological damage to a lot of those people with that introspection, unwarranted introspection. On the other hand, we learned a lot. So I'm still of two minds about the Milgram experiments, but I think it is problematic.
So you think that knowing that if you were a psycho would cause you suffering if you found out that you were a psychopath?
Well, one of the ethical questions around medical testing in general is the difference between testing in a situation where there's no therapy and testing in a situation where there is. When we first discovered HIV, there was a line of bioethical thought that people shouldn't necessarily, everyone should just practice safe sex. and that people shouldn't necessarily get tested for HIV, because in what way would that substantively change your behavior? It might allow you to put your affairs in order and so forth, but before there was any therapy, it wouldn't necessarily change people's behavior, and it might depress them so much that it would have negative consequences. This is, the difference between certain people's personalities. Some people want to know these things and some people don't. Once there was a therapy, once there was antiretroviral drugs that both reduced your own likelihood of dying from AIDS and reduced your likelihood of transmitting HIV, then of course there was a clear moral imperative to getting everybody who might be infected tested. I think the same thing is probably true with psychopathy, that some of us want to know if we have these moral traits, even if there's nothing that we can do about them yet. But we actually can do, a lot with these things. There are meditation, there's drugs, there's behavioral interventions for most of the moral defects. And this has actually been one of the complex things about writing Cyborg Buddha, which I know people think is vaporware at this point because I've been working on it for so long. But, really, I've been swimming. I'm a sociologist, and I've been swimming in a sea of the last decade's worth of social neuroscience research, which is just exploding. And our understanding of, for instance, something like oxytocin and what it does to human behavior has gone through like 2 or 3 generations of positivity and then backlash and positivity and so forth. So I give myself credit for even attempting this. But one of the things I've been attempting with this project is to integrate the behavioral evidence for how we can change moral behavior on these various dimensions with the pharmaceutical and the potentially cybernetic ways that we could change it. And there's a substantial number of behavioral interventions, social interventions. For instance, just if you want students not to waste paper at a photocopy machine or at a printer in a school, you just put a big picture of an eye above the printer. Because we know that when people have these passive reminders that somebody might be watching, it's just a picture of an eye, but the passive reminder. Or you casually mention to somebody before they are in a situation where they might cheat or lie, you casually mention to somebody religion or science. Science turns out to have this effect as well. They are more honest. So, we are incredibly complex machines in terms of the things that influence our moral behavior. So having a test that would tell you if you have moral deficits, I think, and there are great tests out there. By the way, one of the best is the VIA test. It's a long test, but it tests for your character strengths on 24 different dimensions. And I've used this model as part of the structuring of my book, of Cyborg Buddha.
How did you fare in the test?
Well, I'm low. For instance, one of my moral defects is that I'm low on conscientiousness.
Okay.
It's partly, I was ADD as a kid. I'm probably still ADD in a lot of ways. And conscientiousness is a personality trait, but it's correlated with things like fortitude and so forth. Now, this part of the debate in moral philosophy is called situationism. Is in what situations do we betray or do display certain kinds of moral traits, and what situations don't we? So, in certain situations, like on my treadmill or on my dieting behavior, I seem to have a high level of fortitude, but in other things, like attempting to grade students' papers, I give up after like the first 5 seconds and say, fuck it, I'm just going to give everybody an A. So, it depends on the situation. It depends on the kind of challenge for everyone. This is true. But I think that the VIA test is interesting because it then gives you this kind of quantified readout that is somewhat validated against existing tests and is related to the underlying personality model that is the most common now in personality theory, the 5-factor personality model. So I would recommend that if people are curious about self-diagnostics of their character strengths and flaws, that they might look at that. And then if they find that they're low on conscientiousness, then there are things that you can do. So in Cyborg Buddha, I'm recommending, for instance, intermittent fasting is a kind of exercise that's not only great for your health, but is also an exercise in controlling something which we consider a very central primal behavioral imperative, the desire to eat. And just being able to control that for a day gives you a sense of accomplishment and inner directed self-control that has a ripple effect through your ability to self-control in other areas of your life. Mindfulness meditation has the same effect. So there are things that we can do, but then, of course, as transhumanists, we also point out, taking methylphenidate or taking modafinil, caffeine can help with that. There's a lot of pharmaceutical things that we can do. And then there's the growing exocortical armamentum. There's, if you find it hard to concentrate on writing because you're always being distracted by Facebook, there's software that you can install on your laptop that locks you out of Facebook for the 8 hours that you've set aside for writing. There are ways to kind of have an exocortical superego that helps you with these things. So I do think it's important for people to have some self-awareness of their moral strengths and weaknesses, and there are things that we can do about it.
Well, that's interesting. No, I didn't mean to. Yeah, I actually didn't mean to interrupt you because you were going to sort of bridge this VIA test, this morality test, into your some foundational thing about your book. I think you mentioned it, but I'm not sure if you finished what you were going to say there. I just wanted to give you a chance.
Well, my book's not about AI. It's about human beings and moral self-improvement in human beings. But I do think that...
Yeah, you mentioned the VAI test.
Oh, the VAI test. Yeah, the Values in Action test.
Okay,
Values in Action, developed by the psychologist Martin Seligman and a growing coterie of hundreds of psychologist researchers around the world. He's the founder of the positive psychology movement, and it's someplace between the self-help domain and actual empirical psychology. There's a lot of a priori, feel-good kind of thinking going on in positive psychology, but there's also a lot of empirical psychological research.
Okay, cool. So, look, how do you think, if an AI, how do you think people in general would react if they found out they were psychos, or if they found out that they had a greater than, a significantly higher chance that they'll pick up an axe and kill someone at some stage in their life? Would people turn themselves in, admit to this sort of mental architecture that they have, and let the authorities know, or let the right people know that this is something about them that they should be aware of, and or would they just hide the fact and hope for the best? And
well, I don't know about turning themselves into the authorities. I don't think that I certainly wouldn't recommend that everyone who found that they had psychopathic tendencies turn themselves into the authorities. You remind me that there was a recent episode of an American radio show called This American Life, which is one of the best podcasts and radio shows in the United States. They did a recent episode on a teenager who had discovered through his addiction to internet porn that he was getting increasingly attracted to preteen pedophilic porn, and went to a psychologist, and the psychologist was freaked out and just thought that they were a bad person, and eventually found a psychologist who would work with him around this. And then he founded a support group, a highly confidential support group for people who had self-diagnosed themselves as having pedophilic tendencies, had not molested any children, and wanted to have the support of others not to. So kind of Alcoholics Anonymous for pedophiles. I think that's a model, a potential model for these really serious psychological issues. But I think, in a sense, all of us need this kind of introspection. I recently taught a class at the local Unitarian church on the virtues, and we did a 7-week course where we talked each week about a different virtue, mindfulness, self-control, and so forth. And I tried to get these folks to be forthcoming, and some of them were, about their own personal foibles and struggles and ways that they were working on self-improvement. I think this is one of the big problems for the secularist movement, is that secularism has stayed away from, for the most part, questions of character and a full-fledged model of what human flourishing looks like. There are huge problems with the religious model, the model of sin or condemnation and so forth. But, what do you say then to someone who says, I recognize that I'm not sufficiently conscientious about, fulfilling my obligations to others. What can I do about that? I don't think it's adequate to say, pray on it. But in secularism, we should come up with some more sophisticated responses about how people can work on improving their own personalities.
Okay. Well, I guess the next question was, if an AI found out that it was psychopath or found out that it was immoral, had these tendencies buried deep within its whatever kind of mind it was built with, whether it's a neural net or whatnot, do you think, what's the likelihood of it actually trying to repair this and trying to make itself more moral? If an AI discovered morality, even, do you think it would decide to be moral?
I don't think necessarily that it would. I mean, this is a part of the debate in moral enhancement as well. There's a debate going on between Julian Savulescu and Ingmar Persson, for instance, on one side, who have argued on behalf of empathy enhancement, and John Harris on the other, who has argued on behalf of cognitive enhancement as the only acceptable form of moral enhancement, both on the grounds that enhancing moral sentiments like empathy is not a form of human freedom, would not enhance human freedom, but also in the sense that morality is itself a cognitive process as far as Harris is concerned. So there's a great deal of debate, of course, for thousands of years about the relationship of sentiments and intellect in the conduct of morality. And I'm basically on the side that says that we need both in order to have what we consider human morality. So for instance, if you think about John Haidt's sense of moral intuitions, I believe that there are deeply rooted pre-primate moral intuitions, and some of these have been observed, of course, in primates. So, for instance, not to harm other people, not to share equally, to punish cheaters, to respect the hierarchy, dominance hierarchy, and power structures. And some of these, like respecting dominance hierarchy, are ones that we have decided to reject on the basis of Enlightenment values. And others we've decided to enshrine and channel and encode, like the desire not to harm people or the desire for fairness, into Enlightenment values. But it's hard to imagine a human being who didn't have those sentiments displaying what we would consider a full human morality. And the example I give, there's a famous trolley experiment which asks people, would you pull a lever to switch a train from a track where it was going to kill 5 people to a track where it was just going to kill 1 person? And most people say yes. And then the second question is, well, if you're standing over the trolley tracks and you're standing next to a very fat man, and you have to push the fat man onto the tracks in order to stop the train from killing the 5 people, would you push the fat man onto the tracks? And most people say no. And the difference between those two scenarios is that the second scenario lights up your amygdala with disgust emotions in the way that the first scenario doesn't. And the amygdala basically tells your cortex, I don't care what reasoning you come to, we're not going to do that. Now, you train soldiers and you train public policy thinkers and you train all kinds of people in all situations to overcome those irrational disgust sensitivities and make the rational choice. So if a general had to go on the basis of empathy and disgust at sacrificing soldiers on the battlefield, then they would lose, because you sometimes have to send men to certain death in order to win a battle. In public policy, if we tried to enact public policy where no one ever got killed by anything, instead of having a general consequentialist utilitarian calculus, then we would have a completely screwed up society. So we have to have consequentialism in a lot of parts of our lives, and we want people to come to consequentialist conclusions. But it turns out that the only people who come to them completely unreservedly, 20% of people do say, yes, I'll push the fat man onto the tracks. And of those 20%, they are more likely to be psychopathic. And if you have certain kinds of brain injury that severs the relationship between your amygdala and your cortex, so that those disgust sensitivities don't filter up into your brain, those people say yes. So yes, if you have a robotic, what we think of as a robotic approach to consequentialist logic, you can come to the conclusion, which from a purely intellectual point of view is the correct conclusion. One person dies versus 5. That's the purely intellectual correct conclusion. But we know that most human beings have a real hard time coming to that conclusion because of the sensitivities around disgust, of having to kill someone with their own hands. And we want people to have that disgust, even if they come to the conclusion, overcome that disgust, and come to the conclusion they have to kill somebody. We want them to feel that disgust. So in that sense, I think, it's very complicated to imagine what the full emulation of moral sensibility in a machine will look like, since we have to emulate so many of the complex embodied primate sensibilities that in order for it to not just seem robotic in its behavior. And I think the people who have thought the most about this is Wendell Wallach and his co-author in the book Moral Machines, because they really take apart the question of what morality is and argue for character development, basically as a model for what machine morality should look like.
Right, and so you agree with the character development as well as the utilitarian cold calculus. But I mean, it seems as though Wendell Wallach is just really, is he only just focusing on character development and not actually trying to develop a potential to be able to think things out consequentially as well?
No, being able to think things out consequentially is a part of and a fruition of character development. This is part of my own Buddhist approach to things. The Buddhist approach says that you start from wanting to do the good because it will reduce your own suffering. So that's a kind of purely selfish motivation. And then you start working on your character and you become less likely to be aggressive and so forth. And eventually you have an empathic motivation for other beings. But eventually the motivation is empathy for all sentient beings, and empathy for all sentient beings can be understood as a consequentialist motivation. So insofar as Buddhism represents a Western set of ethical ideas, it embodies both the virtue ethics ideas and consequentialism. Consequentialism is the fruition of character development. But we want them we want people who make consequentialist decisions not to make them in a robotic way. We want them to make them with the full angst of knowing that you're sacrificing real human beings and their interests.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, right. So do you think it's better to try and fit virtue ethics or character-based ethics within a framework of utilitarian or consequentialism, or the other way around? Would you feel more comfortable, or do you think it's better to frame consequentialism as a virtue, as a character that's only really virtuous if it's considered a character?
Well, I don't quite think about it that way. Let me say another thing about the relationship between the two. I've been very impressed by Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen and their effort to improve on consequentialism. They are interested in public policy ethics, and in the end, public policy ethics can only be consequentialist. It's tragic and incomprehensible when it's not consequentialism. In other words, if you try to do virtue ethics or purely deontological, rule-based approach to public policy, you end up with the Taliban and ISIS now in Iraq and so forth. So consequentialism aimed towards some kind of goal, and the goal that we have discussed most frequently is happiness or hedonic consequentialism. What Nussbaum and Sen have been suggesting with their capabilities approach is that if we have a fuller concept of what a truly flourishing human life is beyond just happiness, then we can have a consequentialism, a public policy consequentialism that attempts to create the best possible conditions for all human beings to achieve all the capabilities of a truly flourishing life, which includes being happy, hopefully, as one of the consequences, but is not primarily focused on being happy. It includes also things like having moral sensibilities and sense of obligation and capacity for play and relationship with nature and so forth. So on the one hand, I think consequentialism and utilitarianism can fit within one characterological model, which says that to be a truly good consequentialist takes a hell of a lot of intellectual development, moral reasoning development, to eventually get to that point where you can do it well. And on the other hand, the consequentialism can be aimed towards something more than simply making everybody happy. It can be aimed towards making everybody the best that they can possibly be in a rich sense, which includes virtue and character. One of the reasons that that's important to me is because I've been in this kind of long intellectual, mostly in my own head, but dialogue with David Pearce's abolitionism and the argument that he makes that we should aim public policy towards hedonic consequentialism, or to making everybody as hedonically happy as possible. And I'm very concerned about the land of the lotus eaters problem. That there could be levels of happiness which would be demotivating and lead to social stasis and not be flourishing. And so I think that we have to get away from that kind of hedonic consequentialism and get towards a more sophisticated version of what it means to have a flourishing life.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, and I'm pretty sure that David does too, believe it or not.
I know he squares that circle in his own head, but I know he squares that circle in his own head, but I'd like to see more discussion about it.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed him on that point, and my point is that yes, if the consequence is for the most peak experience of happiness can be achieved in like 2,000 years, then should we sort of aim for this? And could we get stuck in some narrow bandwidth of local maximum where we optimize all our value into achieving some form of like orgasmonic experience that is just like so far above any form of hedonistic experience we can imagine? But hey, we won't be worried about like doing the right thing. We won't be sort of making decisions about morality. We'll just be sitting around quivering lumps of orgasmatronium for the rest of time and all eternity. But we could be stuck in a local maximum if we're not curious and we don't have the wish to sort of explore the universal possibilities of what flourishing means. If we get stuck, then we're not going to spend any of our optimization power on trying to find deeper and richer sort of vistas to explore in this. And the other thing is, if we did sort of go for that narrow bandwidth of value, it's likely we'd dumb ourselves down so much that we may be totally committed to that experience without any intelligence or foresight into what it could look like over that mountain over there, right? So, yeah. However, if we did have a complex value system, and I'm sorry I'm ranting, but then even if some of the community did decide to do this narrow bandwidth of pleasure thing, they could, because the narrow bandwidth of pleasure could be encoded in a more complex value system. And it's
that's David's argument, that we could have gradients of bliss that would be as motivating as our current.
He calls it information sensitive or intelligent gradients of bliss. Yeah.
Right. I think that the problem with that is the hedonic treadmill, that every time, our current experience of life is entirely different from what our ancestors had. We have far less tolerance of pain because we have analgesics. So we experience suffering around forms of pain that our ancestors would have had to learn to adapt to and tolerate. In a similar way, our descendants they may in fact have these gradients of bliss, but being bliss 1 will be the form of suffering in that day and age, and being bliss 10 will be the form of happiness. And I don't see the existential. I think it could be a form of progress, but I think in effect we will still experience. And this is the goal of it being motivating. We would still want bliss 10 versus bliss 1. So there will still be suffering in that world, even though the standard of suffering changes. So that's part of the philosophical conundrum.
Yeah, whether it's actually a standard of suffering that changes, or whether suffering is on a completely different scale than pleasure. Whether we're going to change.
Right. I mean, today, losing one child is an inconceivable suffering for most families. In the past, it was losing all your children, right? Most people lost half their children in the past. And so, just our expectations change, and that doesn't mean that the nature of suffering changes. This is the fundamental Buddhist point. The nature of suffering is that we want things. As long as we want things, we're going to suffer. Even if the things that we want are the choices between a big house and an even bigger house, if we don't get the even bigger house, we're still suffering, even though we got a house that's bigger than all the houses that anyone ever had before. So I just think David needs to reflect more on that.
Fair enough. It would be awesome if... I've just found out how to do online meetings. And maybe one day we can sort of get a few people together, including you, David, and some other 2 others, to do an online panel on this very subject.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah. You can get your boxing gloves on, your kid gloves. Yeah. But yeah, look, I'm in totally awe of you guys who sort of write and put out so much material on this very subject. It's so important. A lot of people just don't feel as though it's tractable, or it's in their sphere of interest. But yeah, I think it's awesome. So, and I cut in there. Sorry.
Fine.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, talking again about moral enhancement. Will our AIs be coaching us? If referring back to this sort of moral advisor theme that we touched on before, do you think our AIs could teach us to be more moral, like through some reverse Turing test for morality? For like, instead of us testing them, they can constantly test us, and then if they find something's wrong, something's out of whack, then do something, or at least inform us as individuals, or inform some centralized authority figure to stop that young sort of crazy dude with his chemicals and his biotech experiments in his lab, just about to unleash a new form of anthrax onto the world. Yeah. So.
Well, there's 2 questions there. Well, the first is, will our exocortex have the capacity to teach us morally relevant reasoning, traits, behavior? And I think yes, absolutely. We already have created many forms of that kind of software. In fact, in the latest book that Damian Broderick and Russell Blackford put together, a collection of essays about intelligence called the Intelligence Unlocked, Intelligence Intelligence Enhanced.
Intelligence Unbound.
Intelligence Unbound, yep. The first essay in that is by me, and it's a review of morally relevant apps, because what I'm pointing to there is that our appetite for and these kinds of apps point to a future in which increasingly sophisticated brain-machine interfaces will provide us the ability to control moral behavior, cognition, sentiment. So yes, I do think that those are on the way. And of course, we're also trying to figure out AI-based forms of pedagogy. So the ways of eventually having a kind of personal tutor in your pocket that identifies just through conversation with you and through knowing your life what you need to learn in every moment in order to become a better and better person and know more about the world. That kind of personalized pedagogy will, I think, eventually replace the machine age, the factory age kind of pedagogy we have now, where every kid who's 6 years old is supposed to learn these 5 things, and it doesn't make any sense at all from a developmental point of view. So, well, it makes some sense, but not as much sense as the personalized one will do. And so when you put those two things together, eventually we'll have that kind of Kohlberg in your pocket, teaching you increasingly sophisticated forms of moral reasoning and pointing out ways that you can improve your self-control, pointing out ways that you can expand your capacity for empathy and so forth. Yes, I do think those are on the way. But the second question is whether, how those kinds of software will be plugged into the rest of the world and what kinds of cognitive privacy you're going to have. In the pedagogical context, we have a tremendous amount of interest in how kids are doing and rolling all that information up by classroom and then by school and then by nation and knowing where our deficits are and what we should be putting more effort into and which kids are going to be doing well in college and which aren't. We will have clearly the same curiosity about people's moral capacities. We have a kind of various ways of getting at that today. We put people through lie detector tests for sensitive jobs. We do background checks. We have psychological tests that we do for certain kinds of jobs. For electing public officials, we want to know about their personal lives and their religious histories and so forth, so we can have some kind of proxy measure for their reliability and their common sense and so forth. Having knowledge about what kinds of pedagogical progress they've made with their moral tutors and what kind of morality software they're running, whether they're running Sharia 5.0 or, John Stuart Mill 6.5 or whatever, that's going to be pretty interesting to all of us in the future. And defending our cognitive privacy is going to be just as complicated then as it is today. Making sure that your employer doesn't have the right to force you to pee in a cup is something that half of all American workers have already lost as a right to privacy. And probably in the future, just as they have to take psych tests and urinalysis, they'll probably have to take morality tests and disclosures as well.
Right. So I think we are sort of moving into a time that we will need to sort of pass more and more moral tests. Hopefully we can get our AIs to do the same before they reach superintelligence. So, look, I'm in favor of digital moral helpers. A question which came to mind was, okay, well, it's very morally relevant to make humans more moral. What if AIs were more capable of being more moral than humans? Do you think that they could be even more moral if they were sentient? Is there any form of morality that seems to do better with sentience or with consciousness in your theory, in your idea? What do you think?
Well, I wrote an essay about this a couple of years ago for Patrick Lynn's collection on robot ethics, and it was a reflection on what a Buddhist idea of robot ethics looks like. I think the sense in which self-awareness would contribute at all to making robots more moral is only makes sense in a characterological model that says that at some point achieving self-awareness and selfish desires that are going to separate you necessarily would be a transitional stage to a higher level of moral sensibility. So, for instance, we were talking earlier about the difference between someone who makes a machine-like calculation of utilitarian consequentialism versus someone who has the primate sensibility of not wanting to harm people. But you can imagine programming those two things into a robot. You can say, on the one hand, you have the imperative not to harm people, but then probabilistically, you're going to have to overcome that in certain circumstances for certain kinds of consequentialist aims. And the struggle between these two principles will be reflected in your virtual face by, the degree of grimace that you have to make when you have to let certain people die to save others. All of that can be done without self-awareness and without any selfish desire, and in fact, better. It'd be better to have a moral robot governor advising you, or moral robot governing traffic patterns, or whatever it is. It'd be better to have one that didn't have any skin in the game, didn't have any personal stake related to its own survival or its own likes or dislikes or any of those kinds of things. All those complex moral interactions could probably be done better without self-awareness. Now, the one way in which self-awareness might be better is if you believe in something like a bodhisattva. And that is a creature who has to go through the level of selfishness, self-awareness, the illusion of self-awareness, and then transcendent in order to achieve a higher and more transcendent level of wisdom and compassion for all sentient beings. That's the kind of Buddhist idea that the idea is not to remain a stone. A stone sees the world as perfect the way it is. The Buddha said the world is perfect the way it is. That's wisdom, but the world also is full of suffering, and all sentient beings need to be saved from suffering. In order to achieve that level of kind of cognitive complexity, where you see the world as both perfect and needing to be fixed of its suffering, requires going through this stage of the illusion of self. So, yes, I have argued on behalf of that, but I still think that for the vast majority of applications, we don't want self-aware robots.
Right, okay. So, I guess now I'll ask you about, I think you've written about this, where you'd like to see a future where we all sort of can connect to some sort of hive mind, and I guess maintain at the same time some form of like individual self, like being like just one face in a multifaceted, like being a jewel that reflects every reflection from every face on all the other jewels, in a sense. You said it so well. Do you want to elaborate on that metaphor? And do you think that's very similar to the Buddhist idea of transcendence?
Buddhism has some implicit social dimension to transcendence. I mean, the three jewels of Buddhism are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha being the community that's attempting to transcend. And so there are implicit social ethics and implicit ideas about a kind of social gospel, teleos of society. Especially if you look at the eschatological literature, there's a notion of eventually society being full of people who live 50,000 years and wish-fulfilling gems that, satisfy all our needs, and the government collapses because we all become such good people, and so forth. So there are these kinds of social eschatological ideas in Buddhism. In terms of the Borg, though, and the kind of Borganism or global brain proposition that some singularitarians talk about, the more social-minded singularitarians, I think, again, they have a limited imagination about what the trajectory has been. That if we look at the history of our species, we have always been creating one another through interaction. And that if we look at the role of education and the role of literacy, it's people downloading the contents of their minds onto paper and other people uploading them again through their eyes in ways that create a sense of shared memory, shared experience, shared identity. That's why we have Islamic fundamentalism or liberal democracy or all the movements that we talk about, because people created those kinds of shared identities at a meta level through these experiences. Now, the next stage of this will be brain-machine interfaces and whatever kinds of sharing of identity and memory and feeling that can happen through these new modalities. But it's in a long trajectory of our experience as a species in creating groups of various kinds with various kinds of sharing. As I said, the Catholic Church is a organism that behaves in an organismic way. It's one of the most successful that there's ever been. And it has an elaborate process of trying to get people to think in terms of that organism. So the next stage in this will be then having your catechism chip in your head that reminds you, whenever you forget about your catechism, or is running the Hail Marys in the background or whatever. Yes, I do think that will come about. The degree to which people sacrifice their individuality, we see, for instance, with Islamic fundamentalism, thousands of people sacrificing their lives in suicide missions, saying that they would rather be a part of this organism and die than be an individual. So, and that's been true throughout the history of warfare, people willingly allowing themselves to be killed for one reason or another. So I think that there will be forms of organism in the future where people will fully sacrifice individuality, become more or less insectile. I don't see that as a fully flourishing life, although you get into this kind of meta ethics question of, well, fully flourishing life for what? It's maybe fully flourishing for the organism and not for the individual. Just as cells had to give up their individuality to become part of a multicellular organism. So, yeah, it's going to be complicated. And as I have often quipped, does the Borg get one vote or a million? I think the political questions are going to be pretty challenging. The economic questions, Robin Hanson, I'm not a big fan of Robin Hanson's social futurism, but one of the questions that Robin Hanson has posed is, if we have uploaded minds and they start repeating themselves or copying themselves ad nauseum, and then who gets the property? If the human who uploaded his mind owned property, does his one copy in the cyberspace get half his property or what? And then if it copies itself a million times, they all get a millionth of the property or what, et cetera. Those kinds of questions will be pretty complicated.
Yeah, certainly. There's plenty of people who seem to be arguing now that we should be optimizing for more happiness, no matter how many agents it's distributed amongst, and that we should value the happiness of organisms that have not yet been born, like, for instance, or not yet been copied or cloned, created, or whatnot. So, leading to what has been, I think Parfit has mentioned, this sort of repugnant conclusion where there's so many individuals, there's so many people. If we're going to be completely fair, we need to distribute the resources relatively equally, but the amount of resources each person gets is relatively low compared to what they would get if there were way less people.
Right. Now, the repugnant conclusion becomes exponentially more repugnant in a virtual mind space, because it's not just a question then of human beings populating the planet. I'm pretty optimistic that human beings by themselves could stay one step ahead of immiseration and probably become increasingly, have increasingly qualitatively improved lives on this planet, even if we had radical life extension, which currently the population is going to stabilize in about 50 years. and then begin to decline because fertility rates have this negative relationship with affluence. But if we had radical life longevity, then whatever children we would have would then, slowly the population would grow. But in the context where we had radical longevity, I think it's also pretty likely that we would have a lot of other technologies that would keep the quality of life continuously improving. But in a virtual context, there's no guarantee of that. Those kinds of material constraints and material predictability, all bets are off. You could have, and this is, of course, Hanson's projection is that once we create uploaded minds in a capitalist economy, they're going to compete with us, take all of our jobs, immiserate all human beings, and then probably cannibalize one another until there's, monopoly in cyberspace. I think Marx is probably even more correct for his scenario than he was for human beings. The likelihood of proletarian revolution against such a scenario is very likely. But at any rate, yeah, I think there's some complications ahead.
Definitely.
Repugnant conclusions.
So, well, it's been wonderful talking to you. We've had a really very interesting long voyage here today. Is there anything that you'd like to say? Like, is there anything that people should take home, and any sort of thing that you'd like to sort of conclude on?
Well, if they're interested in moral enhancement, certainly sign up for the Trans Spirit list that we run on Yahoo groups. That's where we share a lot of. Yep, Trans-Spirit. That's the group that Mike Latorra, who's been running that list for 8 years, and I run. And that's where we share research relevant to moral enhancement, research about the social neuroscience, potential therapeutic applications for things like autism and so forth. Then we also have resources related to moral enhancement at the IET site. There's some things that are going on in the background that I'm excited about. We have a new contemplative technologies group of developers from around the world who are working on technologies to benefit spiritual exploration and meditative experience and so forth that I'm a part of. I guess I would recommend that people go to the VIA site, if they just Google it, Values in Action, take the Values in Action test and do a little bit of that self-diagnostic and think about ways in which they could work on their own character. But your original question was about the Turing test, and do I have any final thoughts about the Turing test? No. The Turing test, as George Dvorsky recently wrote, is bullshit, so don't worry about it at all.
Cool. All right, no worries. Well, I'll try and find these and get some links in the description. If you can send them to me, that'll be even better. But sure, there is also a Facebook group on moral enhancement. It's not very big at the moment.
Yes, that's right.
I've invited a number of people, not too many, but it's been going well. Alrighty then. Yes, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for listening. Cheers.
Sure, my pleasure.